The palace was alive with tourists, cameras clicking, voices blending into a hum of excitement. At the gates stood the royal guard, motionless and dignified, wearing his traditional uniform. He was a symbol of discipline, pride, and unwavering dedication, trained to remain calm under any circumstance. People admired him, took selfies beside him, and marveled at how he didn't flinch, no matter how close they got. Among the crowd was a group of tourists who seemed more interested in causing mischief than appreciating the rich history surrounding them. One man in particular, Mark, a young traveler with a cocky attitude, decided he was going to test the limits of the guard's patience. "I bet I can make him blink," Mark boasted loudly to his friends, drawing a few chuckles. Mark stepped forward, standing uncomfortably close to the guard. He waved his hands, made silly faces, and even pretended to trip into him. The guard didn't move an inch, his eyes fixed straight ahead, completely unfazed by Mark's antics. His friends laughed nervously, sensing the growing tension in the air. Other tourists glanced at the scene, some whispering their disapproval. "What's the big deal?" Mark said, shrugging off their stares. "He's just a guy standing there. It's not like he can do anything." His tone was loud enough to draw more attention, and several people in the crowd frowned at his disrespect. But Mark wasn't done. He wanted to prove that he could break the guard's calm. He looked around and spotted a small tea stand nearby. Grinning to himself, he walked over, bought a steaming cup of tea, and returned to his spot near the guard. The crowd started to grow uneasy as they realized he wasn't planning anything good. "You think you're so tough, huh?" Mark said under his breath, stepping closer to the guard. He raised the cup of tea and, without a second thought, tossed it forward. The tea splashed onto the guard's pristine uniform, staining the deep red fabric and trickling down to his polished boots. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The crowd held their breath, waiting to see how the guard would react. Would he finally break his composure? Would he confront Mark? But the guard did nothing. He stood tall, his face unreadable, as if the tea hadn't even touched him. His stoic expression didn't falter, and he remained as steady as ever. Mark's grin faltered. He had expected some kind of reaction. A shout, a glare, anything. But the guard's calm demeanor caught him off guard. The crowd murmured in shock and disapproval, and someone whispered, "He should be ashamed of himself." Suddenly, a palace security officer appeared, calmly approaching Mark. "Sir," he said firmly, "you need to step away." Mark's confidence wavered as he realized the attention had shifted to him, and it wasn't positive. The crowd's judgmental eyes bore into him, and for the first time, he felt a twinge of embarrassment. The royal guard remained still, a symbol of restraint and dignity, as the situation unfolded. The scene left everyone wondering what would happen next. Mark stood frozen as the security officer's firm voice broke through his false sense of confidence. The crowd around him was no longer amused. The laughter that had echoed earlier was replaced by murmurs of disapproval and shocked glances. The weight of their judgment settled on Mark, and for the first time, he felt a pang of regret. But all eyes were still on the royal guard. The tea had stained his uniform, the dark streaks stark against the bright fabric. Yet his face remained calm, his posture steady. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even look at Mark. It was as if the man who had thrown the tea didn't exist. The silence was deafening. Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his friends, who now stood awkwardly behind him. They no longer looked entertained. Instead, they seemed embarrassed to be associated with him. Mark tried to laugh it off. "Come on, it was just a joke," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. The security officer stepped closer, his expression firm but controlled. "Sir, this is not acceptable behavior," he said. "The royal guards are here as symbols of tradition and respect. You've disrespected that, and it's not something we take lightly." Mark's face turned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but the officer raised a hand. Please step aside and follow me, he said calmly but with authority. Mark hesitated, glancing at the guard one more time. He half expected the man to say something, to acknowledge him in some way, but the guard remained silent. The stillness was almost eerie, and it unsettled Mark more than any shouting ever could. As Mark was led away by the officer, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the tension lingered in the air. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disapproval. A woman nearby muttered to her companion, "How could someone behave like that? It's so disrespectful." Meanwhile, the royal guard stood exactly as he had before, his gaze straight ahead, his expression unchanged. But inside, he was not as unaffected as he appeared. Though trained to maintain composure, he couldn't ignore the sting of being disrespected in such a public way. He thought about the years of discipline, the hours of standing in the cold and heat, all for moments like these, to show strength without words, to remain dignified no matter what. And that's exactly what he did. Nearby, a young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing at the guard. He didn't even move. "Dad," the boy said, his voice filled with awe. The father smiled, leaning down to whisper, "That's what true strength looks like." As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, the crowd slowly faded away. But the story of what had happened spread quickly. Videos of the incident were already making their way online, with people praising the guard's calmness and criticizing Mark's behavior. Mark, sitting in a small office with the security officer, began to realize the gravity of what he had done. The officer didn't scold him but spoke firmly about respect and the importance of honoring traditions. Mark sat in silence, the weight of his actions sinking in. Outside, the guard continued his duty, standing tall, a quiet reminder of dignity and respect in a world that sometimes forgets their value. Mark sat in the small office, his confidence drained. The security officer's words still echoed in his mind. Respect is not just about traditions, it's about understanding the effort and discipline that others dedicate to their roles. Mark had thought his actions were funny, a harmless joke, but now he realized they had been anything but. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, staring at the floor. The weight of what he had done began to sink in. The royal guard hadn't shouted, hadn't reacted, hadn't even acknowledged him. Yet that silent strength spoke louder than any words ever could. It was unsettling. The security officer, a calm yet authoritative man, stood in front of him. "Do you understand the significance of the royal guard?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "I guess. Not really," he admitted quietly. The officer sighed and began to explain. "The guards aren't just people in fancy uniforms standing around for pictures. They represent centuries of history and dedication. They are trained to uphold their duty no matter what, to stand tall even in the face of insults. What you saw today wasn't just a man standing still. It was a symbol of patience, discipline, and respect for something much larger than himself." Mark listened, feeling a mix of shame and regret. He had been so focused on getting a reaction that he hadn't thought about what the guard's role truly meant. He remembered the whispers from the crowd, the disappointed looks, and the awe in the young boy's voice when he admired the guard's strength. As the officer continued speaking, Mark started to feel small. He thought about how hard it must be to stand there for hours, enduring the stares, the jokes, and even the occasional disrespect. And yet, the guard had handled it with grace, showing more maturity in a single moment than Mark had in his entire day. When the officer finished, he looked at Mark with a serious expression. "You have a choice," he said. "You can leave here, forget this happened, and continue as you were. Or you can take this as a lesson, reflect on your actions, and learn from it." Mark nodded slowly. I want to learn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer gave him a small nod of approval. "Good. Then start by thinking about how your actions affect others. Respect isn't earned through words, it's shown through actions." Later that evening, Mark sat alone in his hotel room. He couldn't get the day's events out of his mind. He found himself searching online about the Royal Guard, reading articles about their training, their history, and the pride they took in their work. For the first time, he began to see them not as part of a tourist attraction, but as individuals with a purpose. He stumbled across a video of the incident, already circulating online. The comments were filled with praise for the guard's composure and disappointment in Mark's behavior. One comment stood out. True strength is not reacting to disrespect. The guard showed more courage by staying silent than the man did with his loud actions. Mark closed his laptop, his face red with shame. He realized now that his behavior wasn't just disrespectful. It had been selfish. He decided that the next day, he would make things right. The next morning, Mark stood outside the palace gates, clutching the handwritten note in his slightly trembling hands. He had spent hours drafting it the night before, crossing out words and starting over. Now he was nervous but determined. He wanted to apologize, not just to the guard he had insulted, but also to the people who had witnessed his behavior. The atmosphere at the palace felt different today. The crowd was just as lively, with tourists bustling around, snapping pictures, and admiring the grand architecture. Yet, Mark felt a sense of humility he hadn't experienced before. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve to make things right. He approached a security officer near the entrance, the same one who had spoken to him the day before. The officer recognized him immediately and gave him a wary look. "You again," he said, his tone cautious. Mark nodded. I'm here to apologize," he said earnestly, holding out the note. "To the guard, to you, to everyone. I was wrong yesterday. I didn't understand what I was disrespecting." The officer studied him for a moment, then took the note. "Wait here," he said before disappearing into the palace grounds. Mark stood there, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if the guard would even want to see him. After all, Mark's behavior had been inexcusable. Still, he hoped that his apology would at least show that he had learned something. Minutes later, the officer returned, but to Mark's surprise, he wasn't alone. The royal guard, still dressed in his immaculate uniform, walked beside him. His expression was as stoic as ever, but up close, Mark could see the faint lines of discipline etched into his face. Mark swallowed hard and stepped forward. I'm really sorry for what I did yesterday," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't understand the importance of your role or the respect it deserves. I acted selfishly, and I disrespected not just you, but everything you stand for. I promise I've learned my lesson, and I'll never do something like that again." The guard stood silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Mark's shock, he did something completely unexpected. He nodded. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. The nod was more than just acknowledgement. It was forgiveness, a quiet acceptance of his apology. It wasn't the dramatic reaction Mark had expected, but it was more meaningful than anything he could have imagined. The security officer spoke, breaking the silence. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong, and even more to come back and apologize. Let this be a reminder of the value of respect and humility." Mark nodded gratefully, his heart feeling lighter. As he walked away from the palace, he noticed the crowd around him once again. But this time, the whispers were different. People were talking about his apology, some even smiling at his effort to make amends. That evening, Mark sat down and shared his experience online. Instead of defending his actions, he admitted his mistakes and highlighted the dignity and strength of the Royal Guard. The post quickly gained attention, with thousands of people commenting on the importance of respect and self-reflection. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he had done something right. Mark's online post gained more attention than he had ever expected. By the next morning, it had thousands of likes and comments from people all over the world. Some praised him for owning up to his mistake, while others shared their admiration for the Royal Guard's composure and professionalism. It was clear that the story had struck a chord with many. "This is a lesson for all of us," one comment read. "Respect is earned through actions, and the guard showed true strength by staying calm in such a situation." Another person wrote, "We often take things for granted when we travel, forgetting the history and meaning behind the traditions we see. Thank you for sharing this story. It's a good reminder to be more thoughtful." Mark was overwhelmed by the positive responses. For once, he wasn't seeking attention for the wrong reasons. Instead, he was glad that his experience was inspiring others to reflect on their own behavior. Later that day, Mark decided to revisit the palace, not to cause trouble, but to quietly observe and appreciate the significance of the place. He stayed at a respectful distance this time, watching the guards as they stood in their positions, unwavering and proud. He noticed how other tourists interacted with them, taking photos and admiring their discipline. It was clear that the guards held a special place in people's hearts, representing not just the palace, but also the values of respect, patience, and duty. As Mark stood there, a family nearby caught his attention. A young boy was pointing excitedly at one of the guards, his eyes wide with admiration. "Look, Dad. He's like a statue. How does he stay so still?" The father smiled and replied, "It's because they're trained to be strong and focused. It takes a lot of practice to do what they do." Mark couldn't help but smile at the boy's enthusiasm. It reminded him of the awe he had felt as a child when visiting historical landmarks. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that sense of wonder, replacing it with carelessness. But now he felt it returning, stronger than ever. As he walked away from the palace, Mark thought about how much he had learned over the past few days. His actions had been a mistake, but they had led to a valuable lesson, not just for him, but for others as well. He realized that respect wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding the meaning behind them and appreciating the effort and dedication of others. That evening, Mark received an unexpected message. It was from someone who had seen his post online. "Thank you for sharing your story," the message read. "I've been a royal guard for 5 years, and it means a lot to see someone recognize the importance of what we do. Mistakes happen, but what matters is how we grow from them." Mark felt a lump in his throat as he read the message. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to him. He realized that his journey wasn't just about making amends. It was about becoming a better person, one step at a time. The next day, Mark stood outside the palace gates once again, this time feeling more confident in his purpose. He wasn't here to observe from a distance anymore. He wanted to take another step forward in making things right. In his hands, he held a small gift bag and a neatly written note, a gesture of gratitude and respect for the guard he had disrespected. The sun was shining brightly, and the palace grounds were bustling with tourists as usual. Mark waited patiently until he saw the familiar security officer from the other day. Recognizing Mark, the officer raised an eyebrow but walked over. "You're back?" the officer asked, his tone curious but not unkind. "Yes," Mark said sincerely. "I wanted to apologize properly to the guard. I know words can't undo what I did, but I thought maybe this could show how much I've learned." He held up the gift bag. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here. Let me see what I can do." Mark stood in nervous anticipation, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't sure if the guard would even want to see him, let alone accept his apology. But he knew he had to try. After a few minutes, the officer returned with the royal guard. Even in his spotless uniform, the guard's presence was calm and composed, his expression unreadable. Mark swallowed his nerves and stepped forward, holding out the note and the gift bag. I wanted to say I'm truly sorry for what I did," Mark began, his voice steady but humble. "I didn't understand the importance of your role or the meaning behind it. My actions were disrespectful, and I regret them deeply." The guard stood silently, listening. Mark continued, "You showed incredible patience and discipline that day, and I've learned a lot from your example. I just want you to know how much I admire what you do now." Thank you for staying calm and showing strength when I didn't." The crowd nearby began to notice the interaction, some stopping to watch. The atmosphere grew quiet as everyone listened to Mark's heartfelt words. The guard's stoic face softened slightly, and he nodded once, a small but powerful gesture. Then, to Mark's surprise, he spoke. "Thank you for taking the time to reflect and come back," the guard said, his voice steady but kind. "Mistakes happen, but it takes character to admit them and make amends." Mark felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. He handed the guard the gift bag, which contained a small box of chocolates and a handwritten note expressing his appreciation. The guard accepted it with a polite nod, and the security officer smiled, clearly impressed by Mark's effort. As the interaction ended, a few onlookers clapped quietly, acknowledging the moment. Mark walked away with a lighter heart, knowing he had done everything he could to make things right. That night, as Mark reflected on the experience, he felt a sense of peace. He realized that apologizing wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about showing respect and taking responsibility for his actions. And in doing so, he had not only learned a lesson, but also gained a deeper appreciation for the values of humility, patience, and dignity. Mark left the palace that day feeling a weight lifted off his shoulders. For the first time, he truly understood the importance of taking responsibility for his actions. But what he didn't expect was how far his story would travel and the impact it would have on others. Later that evening, Mark's social media post about the incident continued to gain traction. It wasn't just gaining likes or views. It was sparking meaningful conversations. People from different backgrounds shared their own stories of learning about respect, humility, and the importance of understanding other cultures. One comment stood out to Mark. "This story is a reminder that no matter how small or big our actions are, they can teach us valuable lessons. Thank you for sharing this and reminding us to respect the traditions and people we encounter." Touched by the positive responses, Mark decided to take things further. He wrote a longer post explaining in more detail how much he had learned from the Royal Guard's silent strength and calm demeanor. He emphasized how discipline and patience were not signs of weakness, but of incredible inner strength. He hoped his story could inspire others to think twice before acting carelessly or disrespectfully. The post went viral. News outlets picked up the story, and soon Mark was being interviewed about his experience. He spoke openly about his mistake, his apology, and how much he had come to admire the Guard and the values he represented. Mark wasn't seeking fame. He wanted to spread the lesson he had learned. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the Royal Guard became somewhat of a quiet hero. Tourists who visited the palace now looked at the guards with a newfound respect, often pointing out the one who had handled the tea incident with such dignity. Parents told their children about the importance of patience and self-control, using the guard as an example. Even the young boy Mark had noticed earlier returned to the palace with his family. This time, he stood quietly, gazing at the guards with admiration. His father knelt beside him and said, "Remember, strength isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes, it's about standing tall and staying calm, even when it's hard." For Mark, the journey didn't end with the apology. He began volunteering with local cultural programs, helping to promote respect and understanding for different traditions and customs. He realized how easy it was to overlook the significance of things when rushing through life, and he wanted to help others slow down and appreciate the world around them. The Royal Guard, though silent and modest as always, had noticed the ripple effect. He didn't seek recognition, but he couldn't deny feeling a sense of pride, knowing his actions had inspired so many. Months later, Mark returned to the palace. This time, he didn't need to apologize or prove anything. He simply stood among the crowd, quietly observing the guards with deep respect. As the Royal Guard he had wronged stood tall and still, Mark smiled, knowing he had grown into a better version of himself because of that one encounter. Months after the incident, Mark reflected on how much his life had changed. What began as a careless act had turned into a journey of self-discovery and growth. He had learned the value of respect, humility, and the power of silent strength. Most importantly, he realized that every action, no matter how small, could leave a lasting impact. One sunny afternoon, Mark decided to revisit the palace. It wasn't for an apology or to make amends. Those chapters had already been closed. Instead, he simply wanted to observe, to quietly pay his respects to the guards and the traditions they upheld. The palace grounds were as lively as ever, filled with tourists snapping pictures and admiring the beautiful architecture. Mark stood in the crowd, blending in this time. He no longer sought attention or tried to stand out. Instead, he felt a sense of peace as he watched the royal guards stand tall and dignified, just as they always had. As he stood there, a woman nearby nudged her friend and pointed at one of the guards. "Do you remember the story about the guy who threw tea at one of them?" she whispered. "I heard he apologized and even turned his mistake into a lesson for everyone." Mark overheard their conversation and smiled quietly. He didn't need to speak up or take credit. It was enough to know that the story was inspiring people to be better, just as it had inspired him. A young couple standing near Mark had their child with them, a curious little boy who couldn't take his eyes off the guards. "Why don't they move?" the boy asked, tugging at his father's hand. "They're showing discipline," the father explained. "It's not easy to stay so calm and still, but it's their way of honoring tradition. It's something to admire, son." Hearing this, Mark couldn't help but think back to his own childhood. He had once looked at the world with the same curiosity and wonder, but somewhere along the way, he had let pride and carelessness take over. It wasn't until the guard's silent strength showed him a better path that he had found his way back. As Mark was about to leave, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. The royal guard he had disrespected months ago was still there, standing in his usual place. His posture was just as perfect, his expression just as calm. But when their eyes briefly met, Mark thought he saw a flicker of recognition. The guard didn't move or break protocol, but the slightest nod of acknowledgement passed between them, a subtle yet meaningful gesture. Mark felt his heart swell with gratitude. In that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't just about words. It was about the quiet understanding that both people had grown from the experience. As he walked away, Mark thought about how one moment of carelessness had turned into a lifelong lesson. He knew he would never forget the royal guard's strength, patience, and dignity, and he hoped that others who heard the story would take the same lesson to heart. The ripple effect of that single act continued, reminding people everywhere that respect and humility have the power to change not just individuals, but entire communities.